You've spoken about purpose, the value of purpose, or more so the loss of purpose for veterans returning from the war theater, being almost more destructive or more of a problem than what the tragedy they've seen or the trauma they've seen. Can you say a bit about that?
Purpose is what gives life, its meaning. I think everyone needs a purpose to make meaning in life and to have a happy life. Your life, any person needs to feel as though their life means something. And I think as a veteran in war, oftentimes that purpose can be very clear and very intense. You don't need someone to tell you an elaborate story necessarily of why you're waking up each day to do whatever your work is when you're in a war zone. I mean, the reason for getting up can be very immediate. It can be as immediate as the threat that exists to your life, the threat that exists to the lives of your comrades, the immediacy of the mission right in front of you. So I think typically, at least my experience was, I didn't need someone to explain to me, or I didn't need to tell an elaborate story to myself as to what I was doing on this earth when I was serving in the wars. It was very, very clear. It's a very intense sense of purpose. But coming down and kind of folding back into regular life, which is lived at a much slower pace, it can become a struggle for people to find that sense of purpose, to tell themselves that story from which they are making meaning. And there can be real struggles there, and I've certainly seen those struggles, and they can lead to mental health struggles as people grapple. Okay, what's the story I'm telling myself every day as to how I'm adding meaning into this world?
How did you resolve this for yourself? Returning from the intensity of that warfare situation, how did you identify purpose?
Well, I repurposed myself, and it wasn't. It was with its challenges. I felt very blessed, and that I knew there was something else I wanted to do with my life, professionally at least, and that was to write. And so I, started the long, hard work of becoming a writer, and that gave me purpose, and my family gave me purpose. I have children, and children do a pretty good job of letting you know that they need them. So that helped me repurpose myself. But it's different for every single person, but I think at least recognizing that sometimes the rudderlessness we might be feeling might be our own ability to struggle, our own struggles with, what is the purpose, what is the narrative in our own life, is at least a good first step in trying to get back on track.
Can you roughly identify the point in which writing became a significant purpose for you? When did it become a foundation for you?
I didn't know that writing would necessarily be the thing that I would do next. And when I left the service, I had a couple jobs in politics, and I had the ambition to write a book. And I actually wanted to write a novel that was sort of ostensibly about my time in the military. And I'd read books sort of from the Vietnam generation that were similar books. They meant a lot to me, and I felt like maybe I could write that type of a book. And then I think in the course of writing that novel, I started saying maybe this is actually the thing that I should be doing. But the life of a writer is filled with ups and downs, and lots of rejection, and lots of books that didn't work or stories that didn't work. But the one thing the military certainly taught me was how to keep plugging along, and that through that process I was able to kind of repurpose myself. But it's different for everyone, and it's certainly worth acknowledging that it is a struggle. So if it ever feels like a struggle, don't be surprised.
This show is about health, vital signs. And I think we've kind of looked at a profound, a kind of deep aspect of health, perhaps the most fundamental aspect of health in the purpose of our lives. I'd like to kind of zoom it in a little bit more, or take it to a more surface level. We have a widespread phenomenon of post-traumatic stress disorder with a pandemic. You've come from one of the most intense environments in terms of trauma. And I'm interested, how did you keep yourself together in that situation?
I don't know if I used any techniques per se. I mean, I could tell you I read, I like reading, I worked out, I like to take care of myself. I think even in the most, chaotic situations, I would try to carve out time that was just, a moment or whatever it was that was sort of, my moment. I mean, it could be as simple as shaving and brushing my teeth each day, if things were really intense. But just so, to kind of bring myself back to center. But then I think also having a recognition too that, in the moment of of combat or war, that I didn't need to sort all of this out right now. I remember being with the Marines I served alongside during some pretty intense combat, and we would start talking about things and what had just happened the day before, And at a certain moment, I would even say to them, guys who are working with me, like, hey, we don't need to figure this out right now. We're gonna have the rest of our lives to sit around and talk about what just happened. We just need to get through the next 5 days. So just sort of take that switch in your head, and for right now, turn it off and get through this, and then we'll start unpacking it. And then you do, and you start unpacking it, and you talk to each other, you tell stories. I think telling stories about what happened in war is important with people who were there, who understand, and that can go for trauma people experience that is outside of war, because you're taking those events and you're putting them into a structure that makes sense to you. It doesn't mean everyone has to have the same story, but it's the process of the telling and the telling and the telling until you eventually get to the point where you're like, okay, this is what it meant to me. This is how one happened for me, and I understand it. Because I feel like I understand it now, I can put it off to the side and it doesn't have to dominate and live in my mind so centrally. So I think storytelling actually had a big part to coming home. The stories that we told to each other were a vehicle by which we all came home.
Adding a theme to something, adding a structure to it, and you derive meaning from it.
I feel like what you're doing when you talk about it is you're creating a story around it. It's not a false story. It's not like you're taking away from what actually happened, but you're trying to take these chaotic events and put them into a shape that you as a person can digest and can recognize some type of meaning to. Because by making meaning, we're allowed to move on. That meaning doesn't have to be good. It can be bad meaning too, but at least you can then understand, for yourself what happened, and that's different for every person. But I think that the talking about it, or in some cases, for some people writing about it, that's all the process of just an individual getting their story down.
You're particularly positioned to be able to do that with your talent. What about other people that you serve with, other Marines? To frame my question, I was having sleeping problems going back about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I was given information about a particular meditation practice, and I looked into it, and the person I was connected with was a Vietnam vet. And he told me from what I could gather, this was one of the instruments he'd used to kind of help him with the symptoms he was experiencing from his trauma. He also told me that his son had served in East Timor, and he'd been in communication with him while he was in the field, and telling him, you should try this technique, try mindfulness, focus on this part of your body, and gradually relax it, move to the next part. But it didn't. His son couldn't kind of use this. It didn't work for him, and he'd come back home and was drinking to resolve to try and deal with his issues, and had a car accident. Long story, but is there a variant of that kind of something like meditation that is commonly used and that you're aware of?
I know people who've benefited from, a whole host of treatments and practices and everything from meditation. For me, exercise. I like exercising, sometimes to my detriment. I exercise too much sometimes, but being able to just sort of exercise has always kept me centered and grounded, particularly, if I feel stressed out about really anything. But I think if you as a person are looking for that type of help, by the time if you're actively looking, to be more mindful, to find the practice that's going to work for you, I think you're already way ahead of the game, because you're probably going to find out whatever that thing is. I think the challenge is people who, refuse to do that, refuse to kind of get themselves on track and don't want to acknowledge that maybe there's something going on that needs to be dealt with.
What is your chosen exercise? How do you?
I like to run. I like to lift weights. I actually do a lot of the same things I used to do when I was in the Marines. And I like to, when I can, I like to do it with friends. I have a few friends of mine who the way we keep up, and these are friends of mine from my time in the service who are all doing different things now. The way we keep up is we run together. We'll go, one-on-one, once a month or something. Like, hey, you want to go get a run? We'll wake up early in the morning and we'll go run. And I think there's sort of, we'll talk while we run. So that has always been great for me. And if I'm ever, struggling with something, usually I'll reach out to one of those guys, and we'll go have a run and we'll talk about it. But then on my own, each day, 6 days a week, I'm, at the gym doing whatever I'm doing, just because it helps me clear my head. It helps me start the day. And it helps me start the day, I think, with a win, right? Like, you feel like I woke up, I got it done, I'm starting the day with a win. And that kind of will often help me, have other, what I view as like little wins throughout the day. But, again, that's just me. And for some people, it might be meditation, or for some people, it could be something else. But I just think, again, like how I believe, stories matter because they help us organize our thoughts. I think some of those little disciplines matter because they just sort of help us organize our days. And our days, if we don't organize them, can be chaotic and get away from us and be damaging in their own way.
Continuing in the Oppenheimer vein, we're now facing the nuclear threat is in many ways magnified than what it was during the Cold War, but this doesn't seem to get that much attention. One of the functions that art and film form is to represent these threats. Case in point being the film Oppenheimer with the nuclear threat. As an author, is this something that you aim to do, to highlight what you see as major threats in society?
Well, I think what art does, and specifically, I think storytelling in art, is it takes our incredibly complex world, all of the inputs each of us just as people are receiving every single day, and whether it's the news we're reading, the interactions that we're having. And what art does is it takes all of that and it puts it into a story, meaning a shape that becomes manageable for us, for our monkey brains, to recognize, this is what all these interactions meant. This is what all these events meant. This is how they had a shape. And this is also how they had a meaning.
It's finding the pattern.
Yeah, a pattern, a meaning. And so it takes our incredibly chaotic world and it assembles it into an organized form, a narrative that we can digest and then derive some sense of meaning from. And so I think, a film like Oppenheimer certainly does that with the history around the founding of the nuclear bomb, and that meaning that Nolan creates out of Oppenheimer, I think you see becomes a meaning that most of us can intuitively apply to events going on and challenges going on today with regards to artificial intelligence. As a writer myself, that's what I'm always aspiring to do in my books, is to look at the world around me, organize it into a narrative, and then to try to make meaning out of that narrative and to draw characters that a reader can relate to.